I'd now like to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Sean Fischer. Dr. Fischer is a regulatory review scientist at the FDA Office of Food Additive Safety, where he leads the scientific team that reviews requests for FDA's opinion on recycling processes that produce recycled plastics for food contact applications. He also coordinates the review of submissions for the premarket authorization of new food contact substances and provides guidance on regulatory aspects of food contact substances. He was previously a research chemist at the U.S. Naval Research Laboratory and received his Ph.D. in chemistry from the University of Washington. The title of his presentation is Regulatory Considerations for the Use of Recycled Plastics in Food Packaging. So, Dr. Fischer, over to you.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you to all the other speakers for that fantastic lead-in for me. I hope I live up to it. Apologies for not being able to join you all in person there. As of yesterday, the FDA just reorganized the Human Foods Program. And so I realized that the little bio that I gave was actually out of date. The Office of Food Additive Safety no longer exists. Most of those functions are now in the Office of Premarket Additive Safety. But because of the reorganization, there's some administrative challenges and we weren't able to do the travel to get me there in person. So my talk today is going to be focused on the regulatory considerations of recycled plastics when we're looking at its use in food packaging. So first off, I'm going to go through and give a background because to understand how FDA deals with, looks at recycled plastics for use in food packaging, we really need to understand more generally how FDA handles food contact substances. From there, we'll jump into actually talking about the different aspects of recycled plastics that FDA looks at, and spend a bit of time talking about surrogate contaminant testing, which feeds into that review, and then we'll wrap up with some of the outlooks that we have and the challenges that we're facing. So starting off with background here. So legal authority. So the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, which was passed in 1938, gave FDA the authority to oversee the safety of food, drugs, and cosmetics. More relevant is that in 1958, the Food Additives Amendment defined a food additive, which includes components of food packaging. So in the US, components of food packaging that migrated to food are defined as a food additive. And it requires the pre-market authorization of new uses of food additives. And then more recently, in 1997, there was the Food and Drug Administration Modernization Act. This defined a food contact substance and established the Food Contact Substance Notification Program. A food additive is defined as in the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act as any substance the intended use of which results or may reasonably be expected to result in its becoming a component of food unless it's exempted from the definition. And then later on, we had the definition of a food contact substance added. So that is any substance intended for use as a component of materials used in manufacturing, packing, packaging, transporting, holding food if it's not intended to have a technical effect in food. So food contact substances is, the term is actually both more broad and more narrow than a food additive. And what I mean by that is a food contact substance could include substances that are exempted from the definition of a food additive, but only food contact substances that are food additives require pre-market authorization. So the addition to the act there did not create a new burden on industry. And the way that the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act is written is that FDA is responsible for authorizing the safe use of food additives, and manufacturers are responsible for ensuring that their food additives comply with those authorizations. So then when we're actually looking at the regulation of a food additive, when we're looking at authorizing a new substance, as far as the chemistry information goes, what we are interested in is the identity specifications, manufacturing informations, impurities, importantly impurities, conditions of use, technical effects, stability. So this basically encompasses what is the FCS, what is the food contact substance, and what has the potential to migrate to food. And then we're looking at the migration levels in food. So those things that have the potential to migrate, how much of it is actually migrating to food. And so that includes the FCS itself and all its expected impurities, which could be, residual reactants from the manufacturing process or other such impurities, for instance, breakdown products, if we're talking about like an antioxidant. And then finally, from those migration levels, what's the estimated dietary exposure to the consumer? Based on the results we get here, we have different recommendations for the level of safety data that is necessary to establish that the intended use of the substance is safe. So as you go up in exposure, there is more and more safety data that we would want to see to establish that this use is actually safe. So when we're talking about plastics used in food, or plastic to be used in food contact applications, both the polymer and any adjuvants present must be authorized for their intended uses. And then additionally, this is true for all food contact substances, the components must be of a purity suitable for their intended uses. And that part of the regulation is what really comes into play when we're talking about recycled plastics here. So recycled plastics are not authorized separately from virgin plastics in the US. Our authorizations are general, and so they apply to the plastic, to say the polymer, regardless of whether it's derived from a virgin feed or a petroleum feedstock, a bio-based feedstock, or recycled feedstock. So the recycled plastics are subject to the same authorizations, limitations, and specifications, and no action from FDA is required to market food contact articles made from recycled plastics, provided they comply with all applicable authorizations. All right, so now let's dive into recycled plastics for food packaging. So though no action from FDA is required, FDA does accept voluntary submissions for review of recycling processes to see if they are expected to produce material that is suitable for food contact use. When we are reviewing a submission, we're looking at feedstock and source control measures, recycling process and conditions, and the intended use of the material, and then any supporting data that establishes the purity, the suitable purity of that material. The opinion that comes from that review applies to the process that we reviewed. And so basically this means that if you have a company that submits for our opinion from FDA for their recycling process, and then they decide to sublicense that process to other recyclers, those recyclers can rely on the original opinion that we had, provided they don't change anything. So the opinion that results from one of these is commonly called a no objection letter, or NOL. And so an NOL is FDA's opinion based on the information we received that the recycled material is expected to be of a purity suitable for its intended use. Obviously, if changes are made to the feedstock, source control, or any other part of the recycling process, we would not consider our opinion to be applicable anymore. And so we'd recommend, someone coming back and requesting review again. Importantly, an NOL is not an assurance or certification from FDA that the recycled material complies with all applicable authorization. As I said at the beginning, the way the law is set up, that responsibility is on the manufacturer. FDA just sets out the conditions for safe use. So when FDA is considering recycled plastics for use in food packaging, two remain safety concerns are contamination and compliance. In this case, when I'm saying contamination, what we're referring to is incidental contaminants from the prior use of the material. So this could be something like household cleaners, mouthwash, etc. And those substances which might have absorbed into the polymer making it through into the recycled food contact article made from that material. And then on the other hand, we have the compliance issue. So this is now talking about the intentionally added unauthorized substances. So colorants or antioxidants, for example, that are not authorized for food contact use, but got included in the feedstock of a recycling process that's intended to produce a food contact article. So as I outlined before, the safety of intentionally added authorized substances and their impurities was evaluated during the authorization, the original authorization of those substances. The caveat here is that if the recycling process creates new impurities, then further pre-market authorization may be required. So looking at the different components here, when we're talking about feedstock and source control. So for the feedstock, we're interested in obviously what's the polymer type? Are you recycling PET, Ph.D, PE, et cetera? What was the prior use of the articles? Because that's going to really inform what are the possible contaminants that may be present. And then of course, compliance with authorizations. And then when we're talking about source control, these are the methods in place to ensure the quality and purity of the feedstock. And so different examples of different levels you could have would be, for example, limiting the resin type. So say you're only going to recycle PET. Well, that's not a lot of source control. You could go a step further and say you're going to just do PET beverage bottles. Now you're getting a little better. You could take it even further and say you're going to do just PET beverage bottles from bottle deposit programs. So now you have a tighter control over the incoming material, and it's likely to be higher quality. So FDA's view is that most recycling processes, and generally we're talking about mechanical recycling processes here, are unlikely to remove any unauthorized additives that were present. And so source control is very important for making sure that any unauthorized additives don't end up in the feedstock to begin with. Okay, so not all feedstocks are going to be appropriate for recycling into food contact articles. For example, you wouldn't want to, we wouldn't be too keen on you walking down to the chemistry labs there on Michigan State's campus and collecting all of their solvent containers and sending them to a mechanical recycling facility to turn those into food packaging. That's not necessarily going to be an appropriate starting point. Additionally, the more limited the knowledge and control of the income material, the more rigorous the processing will need to be just because of the unknowns about what could be present. As we state in our recycling guidance, we've received information from the plastics industry that verifies that all PET resin used to manufacture containers in the US is authorized for contact use. So a mouthwash bottle made from PET is reported to be food grade, even though it wasn't used for food use. We do not have similar information for any other polymer. So we would probably assume that non-food containers made of other polymers are not authorized for food contact use. So when we're talking about recycling processes, FDA breaks into 3 categories. So we have primary recycling. This consists of a feedstock of unused articles and mechanical recycling process. So this kind of aligns with the post-industrial feedstock that Reed was talking about before. And then we have secondary recycling. So this is the bulk of what people think of when they think of recycling and the bulk of what we see for review. So these are used articles that are subject to a mechanical reprocessing. And then finally, we have tertiary recycling, which Jennifer gave a very, very good overview of earlier. So this is where you're actually breaking down the polymer back into its constituents, its monomers, purifying it, and then repolymerizing. So when we look at a submission, we're looking for details in every step, residence times, temperatures, et cetera, and then any chemicals used in any wash steps, like the caustics and the surfactants that Greg mentioned in his previous talk. So then we get into the intended use of the recycled material. So this has components such as what food types it's supposed to be in contact with. So dry foods, you're going to expect a lot less migration than if it's in contact with fatty foods. And then also, what types of articles are you looking at? You know, basically anything that you can make out of PET, or are you doing something that is much more specific, a niche application, for example. And then conditions of use. The higher the temperature of the use conditions, the higher the migration is going to be. One thing to keep in mind when you're looking at compliance in regard to intended use, the compliance of a food contact material is based on the compliance of the components, and in particular, the most restricted authorization that's present. So if you have a material here made of two food contact substances, one authorized for conditions A through H, which kind of covers all temperature conditions, and one that's only authorized for our conditions of use E through G, which is room temperature and below, then that final food contact material made from those two substances is only going to be authorized for room temperature use and below. So depending on the level of control of the feedstock, the rigor of the processing, and the intended use, you have different types of supporting information that would be required to establish the suitable nature of the feedstock. So as an example, say our feedstock is going to be polypropylene food articles that were gathered from single stream curbside collection. Recycling process, just the conventional mechanical recycling process. So we're going to do some sorting, grinding, washing, drying, extrusion. When we start looking at intended use and supporting information, the intended use might be limited here because of contaminants and types of adjuvants present in the feedstock. So there's some unknowns there, so we might end up with a limited intended use. And then for supporting information, likely surrogate contaminant testing is going to be needed to establish that that material is going to be suitable. So looking at general recommendations for the different types of recycling processes, for primary recycling, as we heard in the earlier talk, contamination is really not going to be concerned here as long as good manufacturing practices are followed because that material hadn't been used for anything. The biggest thing is just to be mindful of compliance of the material, especially if you're gathering material from multiple sources. For secondary recycling, source control is going to be critical for ensuring the quality of the feedstock, and surrogate contaminant testing is generally recommended. Then when we get to tertiary recycling, this has a greater ability to clean and verify the purity of the recycled material, which was excellently demonstrated in Jennifer's talk earlier. And our guidance says that surrogate testing is no longer recommended for PET based on data we had received on those processes early on. So surrogate contaminant testing, what is this? Let's walk through that a little bit. So the purpose is to demonstrate the effectiveness of the process to remove these incidental chemical contaminants. The contaminants here we're talking about are assumed to come from chemicals that are readily available to consumers, because we're generally thinking about plastics that are collected from consumers. Other considerations may apply if you're looking at doing a more exotic feedstock. And so if you have something that is kind of outside the usual bounds of what people recycle, feel free to come talk to us and we can work with you on whether additional information might be warranted. The surrogate contaminant testing is not intended to address whether the basic polymer and any additives meet their specifications, and is not intended to demonstrate removal of unauthorized additives. Again, the source control should be used to ensure that those additives don't end up in the feedstock to begin with. So based on the scientific analysis that supports FDA's threshold of regulation exemption approach to food additives, we believe that dietary concentrations no greater than 0.5 parts per billion from contaminants in recycled plastics are generally of negligible risk. So the surrogate contaminant testing is used to demonstrate that the recycling process can remove surrogate contaminants from the recycled material down to this level. And Also note here that the above here conversation, this is within the context of a good manufacturing practice for recycled plastics. You know, new uses of food contact substances with dietary concentrations below 0.5 parts per billion still require pre-market authorizations. That is to say, there is no self-determination of threshold of regulation exemption. So the protocol for a surrogate contaminant test is to expose the virgin plastic of interest to surrogates. And the idea here is to mimic long-term storage of the chemicals. Then rinse the sample and determine the starting concentration so we know where things are at before the recycling process. Run the sample through the recycling process and then determine the residual levels of those contaminants. And then the residual levels can be used to see if the recycled material has been sufficiently cleaned. So as far as what types of surrogates, FDA recommends some covering a range of possible contaminants. So we recommend choosing a volatile polar surrogate, a volatile nonpolar, a non-volatile polar, a non-volatile nonpolar, and in several cases, a heavy metal salt. These are to represent the variety of chemicals that the plastic might have been exposed to. And so then, as I mentioned before, you'd run this through, and then you'd look at that residual. If you go into our recycling guidance, we've calculated with the assumptions on the screen here, what would be the maximum residual in the polymer that would get to keep you below 0.5 parts per billion dietary exposure for different polymers. And this assumes that you have 100% migration of those residuals. So if you get to the end and the residual levels are too high, some things to consider. First would be migration modeling. We see a lot of migration modeling, and this is very applicable to PET, which has very low diffusion properties. And so the 100% migration assumption is generally is overly conservative in that case. Migration modeling, especially under higher temperature conditions, generally that doesn't do a whole lot for polyolefins. You end up very similar results to 100% migration. You could look at migration testing and actually running a migration test to see how much comes out under, and we'd recommend the protocols that are in our guidance, our chemistry guidance for FCN submissions. You could do blends, obviously bring in the virgin polymer to lower that effective contaminant level, use a barrier, or go to a more limited use, say lower temperature use. All right, so that covers the kind of what we look at in review, and then looking ahead here. So obviously, as everyone is well aware, there's increased attention and focus on recycling. You have, in this country at least, people starting to do look at extended producer responsibility laws. Obviously, more popular. It's been done a lot more in other countries. And similarly, you have some minimum recycled content laws coming into play now. The UN has an intergovernmental negotiating committee on plastic pollution, and recycling has been talked about as a potential mechanism there to deal with pollution. Codex Alimentarius Commission is exploring creating a guidance on recycled material and food packaging. So there's a lot of interest in recycling, especially recycling for food packaging. Looking at our FDA's review. So the first recycling NOLs that we issued was back in 1990. And so over the first, 20 to 30 years, FDA received about 10 submissions. And then beginning kind of late 2000s, that started coming up. And in the last couple of years, we've been receiving over 50 submissions a year. Last year, we had 68. So that's a pretty dramatic increase. The other big change that we've seen is for most of the history of our review, PET was the dominant thing that people were asking us about. And in the last couple of years, there's been a dramatic increase in polyolefins. And so both of these two trends are actually illustrated here in the next slide. So this is looking at just the number of letters that we've issued, which wouldn't encompass all the submissions that we've received because not all submissions result in a letter being issued. But as you can see, in the last few years, not only is there a dramatic rise in the number of polyolefin submissions, letters that we've issued, and so consequently the number of submissions we received, but PET isn't dropping off either. That's been increasing a bit too. So turning to challenges, FDA has limited resources. So the increase in the number of submission as well as the complexity of some of these submissions, which we'll touch on in a second here, may increase the time needed for review. So ask our industry stakeholders to be patient with us. And then when we're looking at going to polyolefins from PET, there's questions around the feedstock. As I mentioned, we don't have really any information about the types of substances that are used in non-food contact, articles made from polyolefins. So there's big questions about the compliance of those materials. Also, polyolefins in comparison to PET are a lot easier to contaminate and they're a lot harder to clean. So there are challenges for getting a HDPE back to something that is suitable to use in contact with food again, especially not having limitations on the temperature and food types and things like that. And there's still some development going on in the recycling technology for polyolefins. I think everyone, PET kind of has a nice steady place where I think everyone understands how to do mechanical recycling for PET. So there's not a lot new there. We are seeing new things with polyolefins, and so that requires us to do some learning as well. And so with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention. I am happy to take any questions now, and I'll be part of the panel as well. But if you have any questions in the future, whether about recycled plastics for food packaging or food contact substances in general, contact information is on the screen here. The top is our general inbox for anything to do with food additives, both food contact and direct food additives. And then my information is also on the bottom of the screen. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Fischer, for a very interesting presentation.